He found her half dead in the desert, and by saving her, he doomed himself to love a woman who already belonged to another. The Arizona sun burned like judgment itself, spilling fire over the wastelands of Dry Creek Station. There, on a splintered bench beneath a dying telegraph pole, sat Nora Grant, 6 months pregnant, abandoned, her lips cracked, her faith shattered. Her husband had ridden off with their last horse, and a promise written in a single cruel line: "Forget me." 1. By dusk, the desert wind had begun to whisper her name like a requiem. That was when Elias Cole, a weathered drifter with eyes like storm clouds, appeared on horseback. He was a man still haunted by the grave of a wife he couldn't save and 2 children waiting for a mother he couldn't give them. When he saw Nora, he didn't see a stranger, he saw redemption in human form. He offered her shelter. Then, in a single breath that would change both their lives, he offered her marriage. "You need a home," he said quietly, "and my children need love." It should have been a bargain born of desperation. Instead, it became a love strong enough to challenge the law, the church, and the ghosts of their pasts. But love in the frontier was never simple, and when the man who abandoned Nora returned to claim what he'd lost, Elias would have to decide: obey the law, or protect the woman who'd already taken his soul. Who deserves her more, the man who left her to die, or the one who brought her back to life? The sun hung low and merciless over the Arizona wasteland, turning the horizon into a wavering sea of copper and fire. The Dry Creek Station stood alone in that inferno, 3 weather-beaten walls, a water trough half full of dust, and a crooked sign creaking in the wind. A single telegraph line buzzed faintly above, as if even messages refused to pass through this forsaken place. Nora Grant sat on the splintered bench, her hands resting protectively over her swollen belly. The wind lifted strands of her hair and sprinkled them with red grit. She hadn't moved in hours, afraid that if she did, hope might follow her husband's tracks and vanish for good. In her pocket was the note he'd left, creased, damp, and cruel. "Forget me. You'll survive better without me." She had read it until the ink blurred with tears. Her voice was gone, dried up by the heat and the ache in her throat. Inside the station, Mr. Hoskins, the grizzled keeper, watched her from the doorway, chewing tobacco and shaking his head. 3 hours, and she still thinks he's coming back, he muttered. That was when the sound came, slow, deliberate hoofbeats. A lone rider cutting through the heat shimmer. Elias Cole, broad-shouldered, sun-scarred, his hat pulled low, dismounted without a word. He tied his mare, drank from the trough, and finally turned. Their eyes met hers, hollow with despair, his heavy with something deeper than pity. For a moment, the desert seemed to hold its breath. In that silence, 2 broken souls recognized each other across the ruins of their past. Neither of them knew it yet, but this place, this moment, would be the beginning of everything. "Ma'am," Elias said softly, his voice rough from sand and silence. "You waiting on someone?" Nora blinked, her cracked lips barely moving. "My husband. He went to find work." The lie stumbled out, fragile as glass. Hoskins snorted from the doorway. "That fella's gone for good, Cowboy. Left her with nothing but that belly and a fool's hope." Elias turned his gaze back to her. There was something in his eyes, steady, weathered, almost painful, in its quiet understanding. He knew the shape of loss. He wore it like a second skin. He crouched beside her, close enough for her to smell the dust and leather on him. "How far along?" 6 months, she whispered. He nodded slowly. "You can't make it to the next town alone. The desert won't show you mercy." She flinched, pride warring with fear. "I didn't ask for yours." "I know." He looked away, toward the dying Sunday. "But I've got 2 children up north. A boy of 9, and a girl who still cries for her mama. She's been gone 8 months now. Fever took her fast." He paused, then said the words that would change both their fates. "You need a roof and a name. I need someone to keep my children alive. Maybe we help each other." Nora stared at him, disbelief twisting through exhaustion. "You'd marry a stranger?" Elias met her eyes again, calm, resolute, utterly sincere. "Out here, a stranger's sometimes the only kind of soul you can trust." "No." A vulture circled overhead, a shadow crossing the red dust between them. Nora looked down at the note in her trembling hands, then back at the man offering her everything she'd lost, without a single promise of love. And for the first time that day, she felt afraid to say no. The next morning, the preacher's voice cracked against the chill desert air. His words were plain, his Bible worn, his tone uncertain, like even he knew this was no ordinary wedding. "Do you, Elias Cole, take this woman?" "I do." "And you, Nora Grant?" Her voice came barely above a whisper. "I do." When it was over, she had a new name, Nora Cole, wife to a man she'd met less than a day before. The ring he slipped onto her finger was simple brass, dulled by years of hard work. He paid the preacher in silence, offered Nora his hand, and helped her onto his horse. They rode north, the trail stretching through crimson canyons and dry creek beds. Elias said little. When she asked about his children, he spoke softly, his words heavy with restrained grief. "Ethan's quiet, thinks too much. Clara, she talks to the wind. Says her mama still answers." By dusk, they reached Silver Mesa Ranch, a lonely spread of land wrapped by cedar and stone. Smoke drifted weakly from the chimney. Two small figures stood by the corral, a boy with his father's wary eyes and a little girl clutching a wooden doll. "Papa," Clara squealed, running toward him. Elias dismounted, caught her mid-air, and held her close. Then he looked back at Nora, standing small and unsure in the gathering dark. "This is Miss Nora," he said carefully. "She's gonna help us here." Ethan didn't move. He studied her the way a wounded animal studies a trap. "Help us how?" Nora opened her mouth to answer, but no words came. She had no idea. She didn't even know if she could help herself. The first days were harder than she'd imagined. The ranch was quiet except for the wind and the restless cattle. The children spoke little. Clara shadowed her with curiosity. Ethan avoided her altogether. Elias worked from dawn until nightfall, fixing fences, tending stock, driving the herd, and when he did come inside, he ate in silence and slept in the chair by the fire instead of the bed they technically shared. Still, every morning Nora rose before dawn, lit the stove, and forced herself to move. She swept, cooked, mended, and waited. On the fifth morning, she found Clara crying over a torn dress. "Papa says Mama made this one," the girl sobbed. "I broke it. He'll be mad." Nora knelt, threading a needle. "Then we'll fix it. Together." The child sniffed. "You know how?" Nora smiled faintly. "My mama taught me. Long before she was gone." Left. By the time Elias came in for supper, Clara was twirling in the mended dress, her laughter filling the house like sunlight breaking through dust. Elias froze in the doorway, watching his daughter laugh for the first time in months. He looked at Nora then, eyes softening a fraction. "Thank you," he said quietly. "It was just a dress." "No," he said, shaking his head. "It wasn't." The days bled into weeks. Slowly, a rhythm took hold. Nora began teaching Ethan to read from a Bible she found buried under old papers. She cooked more than hard bread and beans. She stitched curtains from flour sacks. The house began to look lived in again. Elias noticed. He also noticed how she winced every time she bent to fetch water, how her hands shook after hanging laundry, how she bit her lip when the baby inside her kicked too hard. One evening, as the sun died over the mesa, he brought her a stool and a tin cup of water. "You don't have to prove anything," he said. "You're safe here." Her eyes flashed. "You think I'm doing this for you?" "I'm doing it because if I stop, I'll remember what he did to me, and I can't afford that." Elias said nothing more, but that night, when she woke from a nightmare, he was sitting by the hearth, his gaze fixed on her with quiet vigilance. A month later, the storm came. It started with thunder that rolled across the mesa like cannon fire. The cattle grew restless. By midnight, rain came down in walls of silver, driven by wind sharp as knives. Elias was out in the storm before she could stop him, shouting orders to the ranch hands, driving the herd toward the ridge. She watched from the window until lightning split the sky, and the barn roof caved in with a roar. Nora ran into the storm without thinking. The rain drenched her in seconds, mud swallowed her boots. "Elias!" she screamed, her voice torn away by wind. She found him pinned under a fallen beam, blood trickling from his temple. The horses thrashed nearby, terrified. With a strength she didn't know she had, she wedged her shoulder beneath the beam and pushed. The pain was white-hot, blinding, but the beam shifted just enough for him to crawl free. "Are you crazy?" he shouted, grabbing her. "You were trapped, and you could have died. So could you." They stood in the rain, chest to chest, breathing hard, anger and fear, twisting into something else entirely. Then he kissed her. It wasn't passion. It was desperation. A collision of two people who'd run out of ways to stay alone. When they broke apart, he whispered, "I didn't marry you for this. I know, but I don't regret it." Neither did she. Not anymore. By spring, the ranch had healed, and so had they, just enough to start pretending it was real. Clara began calling her Mama. Ethan started smiling again. Elias laughed once, an honest low sound that startled them all. And one quiet night, as the firelight flickered across his face, Nora realized she no longer thought of Martin Grant. The man who'd left her to die was becoming a ghost, fading under the weight of what she'd found here. But peace in the frontier never lasted. One afternoon, as she hung laundry in the sun, a rider appeared on the ridge. Dust rose behind him like a storm. When he drew close enough for her to see his face, the color drained from hers. Martin Grant, alive, well-fed, wearing a gambler's coat and a cruel smile. The man who'd abandoned her in the desert had come back for what he believed was his. And the world Nora had built brick by fragile brick was about to shatter all over again. Dust rose like a veil before the truth. The rider trotted down the slope with the certainty of a man who believed the world still owed him an apology. Sunlight flashed off a silver lapel pin too polished for a drifter, too proud for a ranch hand. Nora knew that posture before she knew the face. Her stomach went cold, the child within her turning, as if to hide. "Martin," she breathed. Elias stepped out onto the porch, wiping oil from his hands with a rag, eyes narrowing at the stranger, then sliding to Nora's face. He didn't need an introduction. He recognized the kind of trouble that arrives grinning. The rider swung down. He was broader than Nora remembered, cheeks filled by good food and easy whiskey. A gambler's smile, a preacher's ring on his finger, someone who liked the trappings of promise more than the work of keeping it. He lifted his hat, let his gaze stroll slowly over the house, the hills, the woman by the line of laundry. "Well, darlin'," he said in a voice that had once charmed her, "you've been busy." Elias came down the steps, the boards creaking beneath the weight of a man who would not retreat on his own land. "State your purpose." The smile thinned. "Name's Martin Grant. I'm here for my wife." The word landed like a stray bullet. Clara, who had been arranging flat stones into a circle for her doll's tea, looked up. Ethan straightened from the chopping block, knuckles whitening on the axe handle. Nora's hands found her belly. Elias didn't move. "She's Nora Cole," he said evenly. "My wife. Only in the imagination of some prairie preacher." Martin slid a paper from his coat, held it between two fingers. "Got myself a federal marshal waiting a mile down the road. I reckon he'll want to hear the story first, but the end is the same. This woman's married to me. Always has been." Nora's throat closed. The sky felt too big, the land too open, nowhere to hide. Martin's eyes flicked to the curtains Nora had stitched, the fence Elias had mended, the small life that had grown here by hand and hope. He smiled like a man sighting a vein of gold. "You left me," Nora said, and the wind caught the words as if to doubt them. "In the desert, with nothing." Meant. Martin's face arranged itself into pity so quickly it looked practiced. "Darlin', you know how poor we were. I went for work, left a note saying I'd send for you. Then misfortune took its bite. Years of it. I tried to get back." Nora remembered the note. Forget me. She could still feel the world giving way beneath that single command. She looked to Elias, expecting anger, a storm rising, but he was stone. Only his jaw had changed, a tick in the muscle like a smoldering fuse. "Marshall won't be interested in your sob story," Martin added. "He'll be interested in the fact that this lady here has committed bigamy and this rancher's been enjoying a wife not his own. I'm feeling charitable. I'll take her now and won't press charges. She'll come with me peaceful. It'll be better for everyone." Clara stood. "She's our mama." Martin's gaze flicked to the child and softened an actor hitting his mark. You poor little thing. She'll have more children of her own soon enough. But blood is blood, and law is law. The law says, the law, Elias said quietly, hasn't met me yet. For a moment the yard held steady, caught on the tightrope between two men's wills. Then the drumming of hooves broke over the ridge. A badge flashed. A marshal, broad-shouldered, sun-browned. A man who looked like paperwork had never slowed his horse. He reined in sharply. Which of you is Mr. Elias Cole? I am. Mr. Cole. I'm Marshal Sheridan. I've got a warrant here from the territorial court in Redstone requesting the presence of Nora, he glanced at the paper, Grant, to answer a complaint drawn by her husband. He glanced again. One Martin Grant. Calls for her to be taken forthwith to Redstone for a hearing on the matter of unlawful marriage and desertion. Elias didn't look at the badge. He watched Nora instead. She stood very still, like a deer finds stillness when it's out of options. Marshal, Elias said, does that piece of paper also name the conditions of the desert where he left her no water, no shade, no horse, or is that part understood? The marshal's eyes shifted, unreadable. Paper names, what paper names? Martin tried a smile of kinship. Law's the law. Law is only law if it serves justice, Elias murmured. Justice will be decided in town, the marshal said, tone neutral but not unkind. He looked at Nora. Ma'am, I aim to do this clean. You can ride with me. I'd be obliged if there weren't no fuss. Nora's breath hitched. She looked at Clara, who had crept to her side and seized her hand with small, fierce fingers. Ethan didn't move, but pain had shifted his mouth into a shape men wear when something breaks inside them, and they're trying not to show it. No, Elias said. There will be no taken from this place today. Martin's palm brushed the butt of his pistol. Just a habit, just enough to be seen. The marshal's gaze flicked like a hawk. Folks, he said calmly, nobody's drawing iron over a court visit. Mr. Cole, you've got my word she'll be treated with respect, and you'll have the chance to bring counsel. If you're so sure of your justice, you'll find it there. Nora put a hand on Elias's arm. His good arm, still tender from the storm, felt the rope of muscle drawn taut beneath his shirt. She wasn't sure whose strength was holding up whom. If you fight him, she whispered, they'll kill you. I will not lose you too. Elias's gaze cut to hers. The hurt in it startled her. It wasn't fear of the law. It was the thought of letting her go. He swallowed once. You don't go alone. Nora looked down at Clara. The child clung like a drowning thing. Mama? Nora crouched slowly. I promised I wouldn't leave you. I'm not leaving. I'm going to fix this so nobody can tear us apart again. Do you hear me? Clara's jaw trembled. Do you promise on the real Bible? Nora nodded, eyes stinging. On the real Bible. Ethan stepped forward then, placing the axe aside with deliberate care. He looked at the marshal, then at Martin, then at Elias. If she has to go, he said, voice steady as winter, we all go. The marshal's mouth twitched. Maybe amusement. Maybe respect. Court doesn't limit the pews, boy. Elias exhaled. Decision, like a brand, took to his flesh. Marshal Sheridan, he said at last, we'll ride to Redstone. But if one hair on her head is harmed, you'll discover that your threats impress me less than your compliance, the marshal said dryly. Let's keep this tidy. Pack a bag, Mrs. Grant, Mrs. Cole, ma'am. Nora rose and nodded. She went inside and packed by touch 2 dresses. Clara's mended one for Hope, a shawl, a small tin of salve, the Bible. She folded the desert note once more and tucked it not into her pocket this time, but into the back pages of Scripture where the laments lived. When she came back out, Elias held her shawl and draped it over her shoulders with hands that shook. On the porch, his thumb brushed her cheekbone in a gesture so gentle it nearly undid her. You come home, he said, as if words could twist fate. You come home to me. I will. 0. They rode in a caravan of 4, the marshal first, Nora beside him, Elias behind with Ethan, Martin trailing, content like a man who has thrown dice and sees them settling in his favor. The land unrolled, sallow and unforgiving, a page where one sentence had been written wrong and would take a whole town to correct. Redstone was a raw-boned town rattling on loose nails, 2 saloons staring at each other like old enemies, a one-room church, a jail squat as a stubborn thought, and the courthouse painted white once, now the color of bad milk. Folks glanced up as the marshal rode in. Glances turned to whispers, whispers to a slow gathering behind the rail. The marshal dismounted first and offered Nora his hand. For a moment, she couldn't make the distance from saddle to ground. Elias slid down and was there, steadying her elbow. Martin tied off leisurely, sent a wink toward a window where lace twitched. Inside the jail, the air smelled of iron and old sorrow. The marshal didn't lock Nora in a cell. He pulled a chair into the empty office, gestured to it like he'd set a place at a worn table. "You'll sit here till Judge Pollard can hear your matter. That'll be up tomorrow. Mr. Cole, you want counsel, tell Caleb at the telegraph office. He can wire Harrison Blake the best we've got under these skies." "I don't need wires," Elias said. "Blake owes me a poker debt from 2 winters back. He'll ride." The marshal's brows lifted. "Then I reckon justice may arrive in a clean shirt." Martin leaned against a post, arms crossed, wearing satisfaction like aftershave. "Reckon it'll be clear as daylight," he said lightly. "Married to me first, never divorced. That makes any other ceremony a fiction." Nora found her voice. "So were your promises." Martin's smile cracked a hair. "Careful, darlin'. Judges like wives meek as milk." The marshal cleared his throat and cut a look at Martin that said, without need of words, "Shut your mouth while you're ahead." Then to Elias, "There's a boarding house across the square. Mrs. Bauer will take you and the children. You all get sleep. Bring what witnesses you think tell the truth. I'll do my job. You do yours." Elias nodded once. He squeezed Nora's hand, brief, fierce, a vow sealed not in church, but under a badge, and turned away before the children could see his eyes. Night gathered with a thin moon and a wind that sounded like needles through cotton. The boarding house was decent. Mrs. Bauer fed Ethan and Clara biscuits and honey and looked at the 4 of them with the wary kindness of a woman who's seen all the shapes of trouble and knows some turn into family. Elias didn't eat. He sat at the table with a map of names spread out in his head. He sent Ethan reluctant but capable to the telegraph to rattle Blake's memory. He saddled back up and rode to find witnesses. Mr. Hoskins, who had read Martin's note and watched an abandoned woman dry out under a useless sky. Reverend Ames, who had married 2 wounded people under a cross and a dust storm, Ruthie and Lawson Mays, neighbors who had heard Clara's first laughter in months. He found them all. People who remembered what the law sometimes forgets. Mr. Hoskins spat into a can and said, "I seen the note. I'll swear on my own grave." "No." Reverend Ames folded his hands like prayer was a practical business. "The law of men is tidy only where it meets mercy. If I must testify to that, I will." Ruthie Mays touched the sleeve of Elias's coat. "That woman came to you dying and made your home live again. I got a mouth and a memory. They're both yours." By the time Elias rode back, Redstone's moons had spun twice. He found Clara curled in Mrs. Bauer's quilt, her doll tucked to her chest, her breath hiccuping from dreams. Ethan sat guard like a ranch dog, a Bible open in front of him, as if he planned to drag God into court as a witness. "Did you get them?" the boy asked. Elias nodded. "I got them." He settled into the chair by the window, the posture he always took when a storm was coming, and watched until the horizon paled. When sleep took him, it was not rest. It was a man's brief collapse between battles. Morning broke like glass. Redstone trickled into the courthouse miners from the hills, laundresses with sleeves wet to the elbow, a pair of cowhands with hat brims chewed to nothing. The judge sat aloof as an eagle, a man whose eyes had seen the inside of too many disputes and the outside of too few churches. Martin arrived in a clean shirt and a smug silence, flanked by a man in a dusty suit who smelled of ink. His lawyer, sleek as a river rock. Nora entered on the marshal's arm, fragile but upright, hair pulled back tight, the shawl Elias had placed still around her. When she looked for him, she found him standing at the back with Ethan and Clara, a wall where there were no bricks. Then the doors swung wide, and in blew Harrison Blake, jaw like a freight wagon, hat with a new ribbon, grin that promised mischief. He clapped Elias's shoulder and addressed the judge with a bow, as sloppy as it was intentional. "Apologies for my tardiness, Your Honor. The road was longer than my horse's patience." "Be seated, Mr. Blake," the judge said. "Let's try to wake the law with something resembling decorum." The marshal read the complaint. Words fell like stones: bigamy, unlawful cohabitation, invalid union. The town murmured some scandal is a tonic at the end of a hard week. Then came Harrison Blake's voice, smooth as molasses over a whetstone. "Your Honor, the defense will show that Mr. Martin Grant abandoned his wife in the most literal and lethal way our territory affords, left her to die under an Arizona Sunday. We will present the note of renunciation." He raised a hand without turning, and as if conjured, Mr. Hoskins stood and produced the paper, as well as witnesses to the character of the marriage and the conduct since. "We will argue that abandonment constitutes dissolution if not by statute, then by the common law of decency, without which this court is merely a room with chairs." Martin's lawyer stood. "Objection to the sermon, Your Honor." "Sustained to the poetry," the judge said dryly. "But I'll hear the facts." That, and facts came. Hoskins with his tobacco-stained honesty. Reverend Ames with the quiet conviction of a man who had sealed more than one unlikely vow. Ruthie Mays with a picture painted in housekeeping details that courts often trust more than preacher words. Curtains sewn, children bathed, laughter returning to a house laid waste by grief. When Martin's turn came, his lawyer walked him carefully through a story lined with excuses. A man forced by poverty to seek work. A note meant to be temporary. A wife who lost faith too soon. When asked why he hadn't returned sooner, Martin gestured to his boots, to the dust baked into their seams. "It ain't easy to come back when the world's been chewing you." Blake smiled a smile that wasn't kind. "And yet you've managed to arrive with a fine coat, sir. Did pity buy it, or poker?" Laughter stirred the benches. The judge's gavel tapped once warning, not command. "Answer the question," Blake said, voice soft now. Martin's jaw flexed. "The coat's none of your concern. But the character of the man wearing it is the court's concern," Blake said, turning to the judge. "We submit, Your Honor, that a man who abandons his wife to the mercy of vultures forfeits claims to her body and her life. Marriage is not a chain to drag a woman through hell." "Aye." The judge's eyes went to Nora. "Mrs. Grant, Mrs. Cole, what do you say to your marriage?" Nora stood. The room tilted, righted itself under the weight of her own steadying will. She looked not at the judge, but at the two children whose lives had become her courage. "I say," she answered, voice carrying farther than she thought it could, "that the day he left me in the desert, something in me died. I buried that part with the note he wrote. The man who came for me after wasn't looking for a wife. He was looking to save his children from drowning. If the law cannot tell the difference between a rope and a noose, then it is not a law for living people." Silence held. The judge leaned back, steepling his fingers. For a heartbeat too, the court felt like the moment before a storm breaks, air thick with undecided rain. Then the back doors opened again. Not a late witness. Not a sudden confession. A deputy, dusted white, hat in hand. He strode straight to the bench and whispered into the judge's ear. The judge's brows lifted. Something like surprise, then calculation, then caution passed through his features. He tapped the gavel once. "This court will recess for 1 hour." Blake's head snapped toward the deputy. Martin's lawyer whispered anxiously. The marshal's eyes had sharpened to a flint edge. Elias took one step forward and stopped, as if he had collided with the invisible line that keeps decent men from storming a bench. Nora's heart kicked. She looked to Elias, and he to her, and in that thread of distance lay the whole future, quivering. The judge stood. "Before we recess, be informed, new evidence has arrived from Tucson regarding the legal status of Mr. Martin Grant during the period in question." He paused, letting the shock ripple like a thrown stone. "Whether this information clears or condemns, I cannot say until I read it." He nodded to the bailiff. "Court is adjourned till the hour." The gavel fell. People rose in a wash of murmurs. Martin's color had drained just enough to make his lawyer's hand touch his sleeve. Blake turned to Elias with a look that said, "Hold." The marshal stood like a nailed post. Nora felt the room tilt again, the world narrowing to a single thread, a sealed envelope on a judge's desk that might burn down everything she had rebuilt or set it in stone. She closed her eyes for one breath, then opened them to Elias. "Whatever that says," he murmured, reading the terror she hadn't spoken. "You come home." She nodded because there was no other answer a soul in love could give. And as the clock began its slow crawl toward the hour, Redstone held its breath with her, waiting to learn whether the law would honor a promise forged in the desert, or break a family that had taught itself how to live again. When the gavel struck again, the sound rolled through the courthouse like thunder crawling across open sky. Judge Pollard returned to the bench, the sealed envelope clutched in his hand. The room had filled tighter, even the air seemed to wait. He adjusted his glasses, voice slow but sure. "This court has received certified documentation from the Territorial Office of Tucson. It states that Martin Grant was legally declared deceased 18 months ago, his body presumed lost in a mining explosion near Calico Ridge." Gasps rippled. The judge's tone hardened. In other words, this man ceased to exist in the eyes of the law before Mrs. Grant's second marriage ever took place, which means... He looked up, his eyes settling on Elias and Nora. "The union between Nora Grant and Elias Cole stands lawful and binding. And it means, Mr. Grant, whoever you are, you've been living under a name that is not yours to claim." Martin's face turned gray, fury fighting disbelief. "That's a damn lie." Watch your tongue, sir." The marshal's hand found his holster before the word damn even finished. "You can argue with the grave all you want, but I've got a warrant here for Jacob Harlan, alias Martin Grant, wanted on charges of fraud and identity deception." The courtroom erupted. Chairs scraped, boots stamped. Nora pressed her hand over her mouth as the marshal stepped forward and clamped irons around Martin's wrists. He turned his glare toward her. "You think this changes anything? You'll always be mine." Elias moved before thought, before permission, before the law could catch breath. His fist landed square across Martin's jaw. The man hit the floor hard. Silence followed, deep and raw. Elias stood over him, chest heaving, the entire court watching. "You left her in the desert," he said, voice low but echoing like thunder across canyon walls. "You'll rot in the dark you made." The marshal dragged the stunned man upright and out the door, boots scraping the floorboards. When the sound finally died, the judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Cole," he said mildly, "I might have stopped that punch if I hadn't been thinking the same." Soft laughter broke the tension. Judge Pollard tapped his gavel one last time. "This court recognizes Mrs. Nora Cole as a lawful wife, her child legitimate, her home protected. Case dismissed." Outside, the air smelled of dust and relief. The townspeople gathered along the rail, some smiling, some whispering, all bearing witness to a story that would be retold in Redstone for years. Nora stepped into the sunlight. It was brighter than she remembered, and for a moment she simply closed her eyes and breathed. Then Clara's small voice cut through the din. "Mama." Nora opened her arms, and the girl ran into them, sobbing with joy. Ethan followed slower, proud but teary-eyed, his hand gripping Elias's coat. Elias knelt beside them, his voice rough. "You came home," he said softly. Nora looked at him, and for the first time since that day in the desert, there was no fear left in her eyes, only peace. "You brought me home." They stood like that, four souls bound by something stronger than blood, under the wide Arizona sky. Marshal Sheridan tipped his hat as he rode past. "Guess justice got it right this time," he called. Elias smiled faintly. For once, that night, back at Silver Mesa Ranch, the lamps burned late. Nora sat by the fire, her hands resting on the swell of her belly. The world outside was quiet, coyotes in the far hills, wind whispering through dry grass. Elias came up behind her, placed a steady hand over hers. The warmth of his palm steadied her heartbeat. "I keep thinking about that first day," she murmured. "How strange it was. You offering me your name like it was the only thing you had left." He smiled a little. "Wasn't much of an offer, I reckon." "It was everything," she whispered. He leaned down, kissed the crown of her head. "Then let's make sure it stays that way." The baby stirred beneath her fingers, and she smiled. "Her name," she said softly, "will be Grace, because that's what we found." Eli's voice broke on a breath. "Grace Cole." The fire crackled. Outside, the storm that had threatened for days drifted past the mesa without a sound. They sat in silence, the kind that only comes when the worst is over, and the rest of life, wide and unbroken, lies waiting. Spring came to Silver Mesa in a quiet bloom. The air was softer now. The earth, once scorched and bitter, grew green again beneath the rain. The scars of the storm had faded, and so had the ghosts that haunted the Cole house. Inside, morning light spilled through the curtains Nora had sewn herself. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the kitchen. Clara sat on a stool, humming off-key as she brushed her doll's tangled hair, while Ethan read aloud from a Bible so worn its spine had gone white. The words stumbled, but his voice carried a steady pride. In the cradle by the hearth lay Grace Cole, no bigger than a bundle of light, sleeping in a world that had finally earned her. Her tiny breaths came soft and sure, proof that miracles didn't always roar. Sometimes they whispered. Elias stepped in from the porch, his boots coated with morning dew, his eyes still shadowed by old memories but brighter than before. He paused by the cradle, one large, rough hand brushing over the baby's hair. "She looks like you," he said. Nora turned from the stove, smiling. "Then she's trouble already." He chuckled quietly, that deep, warm sound she'd once thought he'd forgotten how to make. "You've changed this place, Nora. You made it a home again." Though. She looked at him, her gaze tender, steady. "You didn't just save me in the desert, Elias. You saved every part of me that I thought had died out there." He didn't answer right away, just pulled her into his arms, the firelight painting them in gold. "Then I reckon we both got saved," he murmured. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain and wild sage, the sound of cattle lowing in the far fields. Life was ordinary again, and that was its own kind of miracle. Nora looked out through the open doorway, where the desert stretched endless and forgiving beneath the dawn. Once, it had nearly taken everything from her. Now, it reminded her of what she'd found: a man who gave without promise, children who healed without question, and a future that no longer needed rescuing. She took Elias's hand and squeezed it gently. "No one should ever be left to die alone," she whispered. He smiled. "No one will be, not while we're alive." "No." The wind rose, carrying laughter and the faint cry of a newborn across the mesa. The desert had returned what it once stole, and this time it would never take again. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave a like to help more people find it. Subscribe to the Western Trail so you won't miss the next tale of courage, love, and redemption. And tell us in the comments what moments stayed with you the most. Every like, every comment, every new subscriber helps keep these stories of the Wild West alive. So saddle up, hit that bell icon, and ride with us on the Western Trail.